in the American Heritage Series.
The Capitol Building of the United States of America. What a majestic edifice. This is one of a very few structures which is recognized the world over. When one sees a picture of this building in virtually any land, they know it's the American seat of government. This grand structure has been the scene of some of the most profound moments in America's history. In its 2 centuries of use, this building, these walls, these grounds, they've welcomed the voices of some of our greatest heroes. This building has survived some of America's most desperate and foreboding dangers, and some of the most important issues of American life and culture have been decided within these walls. Truly, this building has many diverse stories to tell. There are stories reflecting its architectural heritage, its political heritage, and its artistic heritage. But especially interesting are the stories reflecting its rich spiritual heritage.
Many visitors of our nation's capital would be shocked to discover that the faith of our founding fathers has indeed been chiseled in stone throughout our nation's capital. But why has this irrefutable evidence of our great spiritual heritage been covered up and forgotten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Nearly every night on the nightly news, people get to see a picture of historically what was the largest church in America. But they don't recognize it as a church. And that's because they see the dome of the U.S. Capitol, and nobody thinks of that as a church. But for nearly 100 years, the U.S. Capitol was the largest church building in Washington, D.C., and it was one of the largest church buildings in the United States. And we don't think of the Capitol in that sense.
Who was attending that church? Was it common people or senators or elected officials? Who was going?
Well, when you ask about who's attending the church, first think about how many you could fit in the room. Okay. Now, if you watch the president when they show annually the State of the Union address, you see crammed in that room 435 members of Congress, 100 senators. You see all the executive branch in terms of the secretaries of the different cabinet-level departments. You see all the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. You see all the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You see all these people crammed in, and they got the galleries full. You can fit 1,000 people in there. It's pretty tight, but you can fit 1,000 people in. The House of Representatives is really built to handle 435 people that it has. It's pretty full with that, but they cram 1,000 in. When they were having church services in there, they crammed 2,000 people into that building. 2,000 people a week went to church there. Now, that's obviously more than you have representatives or senators, so what you have was the community came there as a church. It was one of the first mega churches in America. Absolutely. We talk about mega churches today.
Yeah.
Now, you know, even today, 2,000 is a mega church, but you got a small population back then.
Yeah.
That's a huge mega church. It's interesting to see one of the first official acts of the House which occurred when our founders moved into the Capitol, an act recorded in the annals of Congress. The Constitution mandates in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that written records be kept of what goes on in Congress. The founders required this because they wanted government open, accessible, and accountable to the people. Within the congressional records, you or I at any time can read what our elected officials are doing and saying, or not doing and not saying, and then hold them accountable. Every debate and every vote which has taken place in Congress from 1774 to the present is recorded in these public records. And it is because of these records that we know exactly what happened when Congress moved into this building. According to the records for late November of 1800, Congress spent the first few weeks organizing the rooms, the committees, their locations, etc. And then, in the first week of December 1800, Congress made an interesting decision. What was that decision? Congress decided that the Capitol building would also serve as a church building. The U.S. Capitol, this building, became a church. The use of this building as a church building is confirmed not only by the records of Congress, but also by the diaries of those who served in Congress at the time. For example, when John Quincy Adams was a U.S. Senator in 1803, he recorded in his diary for October the 30th, attended public service at the Capitol, where Mr. Ratoon, an Episcopalian clergyman from Baltimore, preached a sermon. The week before, he had written, "Religious service is usually performed on Sundays at the Treasury office and at the Capitol. I went both forenoon and afternoon to the Treasury."
you're talking about the U.S. Capitol building in Washington,
D.C.
was a church.
Was a church. They started that in the Records of Congress on December the 4th, 1800. By the way, the Records of Congress are one of the really cool things the Founding Fathers gave us as part of accountability of government to us.
Right.
Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, the Founders said, look, everything that goes on in that building, everything said on the floor of the House and Senate, we want it written down where the people can get at it. People can go online to the Records of Congress, see what their senator or rep said last week, last month, or 50 years ago, or 200 years ago on virtually any issue. It's all online. So if you want to go online, go to December the 4th of 1800, and you'll see that that's when they voted that the Capitol building would become a church building. So, but wait a minute. Why 1800? Why not back in 1789 when the government started?
Right.
Well, a lot of Americans don't realize that the first 11 years of government were in New York City and then in Philadelphia. 1800 is when they first moved into Washington, D.C. So we had the federal government first meet in New York City because they were building the Capitol, finding the land, etc. Then they moved to Philadelphia, and that's where we met next. And then we moved into Washington, D.C. So as soon as we occupy the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., they vote and say, it's going to be a church building. And so what happened was on Sundays, you had alternating between the chaplain of the Senate and the chaplain of the House. They would supervise the service there, and they used the hall of the House of Representatives. It's where the House meets because it's a bigger chamber than where the Senate meets. So that's where they held the church services. So they would alternate on Sundays between the House and the Senate chaplain being in charge. But if a visiting preacher was in town or some distinguished minister from somewhere in the nation, they brought him in to preach on Sunday. So sometimes the chaplains would preach, sometimes it would be someone else. But you start off with 1800. Thomas Jefferson's the vice president, and he's going to church there at the U.S. Capitol. He becomes president in 1801. He's still going to church at the U.S. Capitol. He went to church there for 8 years. The records of the congressmen who were in Congress then record that not only did Jefferson come to church at the Capitol, he came despite the weather. If it was pouring down rain, if it was blizzard outside, he came, and he always came on horseback. I mean, he just came, very common man kind of stuff, would come on horseback, ride through the rain, ride through the snow, ride whatever, he'd be there. Well, they got to where they left Jefferson a place to sit, and it kind of became the place where the presidents could sit, just up front on the front row, because 2,000 people cramming in. I mean, if you didn't get there really early, you don't get a seat. So they got, just out of courtesy, they'd leave the president a place to sit, so when he came in, he'd have a place. Well, because they invited visiting folks in, there's a lot of firsts that happened at the Capitol. For example, the first time that a woman preached at the U.S. Capitol was in 1806.
Wow.
Thomas Jefferson was at service there. Now, Jefferson's a pretty stiff Episcopalian. I mean, he's Anglican, he's Episcopalian. And this lady they brought in to preach, Dorothy Ripley, was involved in the revivals along the frontier. Now, the frontier back then was Kentucky. Kentucky, Tennessee, that was way out west. You know, that's way out there. So she's having these revival services among all these trappers and hunters and pretty rugged folks. And in the Second Great Awakening style, it was kind of the brush arbor meetings, kind of emotional, kind of fervent, kind of... Jefferson's nice little stiff Episcopalian here. So she cuts loose in the Capitol with her, you know, fiery preaching style, and no problem for Jefferson, doesn't bother him, but he just continues to sit there very, very formal, you know, very, very presidential. And she figures, I'm not getting through to him because he's not moving, he's not responding. So she cranks up another notch, and he just kind of sits there, you know, and it's not bothering him, but she's looking for an emotional response. So it's really even humorous to see what happened. But she was the first woman to preach the Capitol.